It was a cold and dark night when we moved into our new house. I had been looking forward to it for months and was excited to start a new chapter in my life. However, something felt off from the moment I walked through the door. It wasn't until a few days later that I met my neighbour. He lived in the house next door, and I could always see him from my kitchen window. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with grey hair and a wrinkled face. Every time I saw him, he would stare at me with a cold, blank expression that always sent shivers down my spine. At first, I tried to ignore him, and I just put it down to my imagination. But then, I started to notice something strange was happening. Every time I left the house, I would come back to find things had moved around or they had gone missing. It was subtle at first, but it became more frequent as time went on. One night I was lying in bed reading when I heard a noise under my bed. It sounded like someone was trying to hold back a cough. I was absolutely petrified, as I knew that sound, and it could only be a person that was making it. I jumped out of bed and ran over to my parents' bedroom, banging on the door for help. My dad rushed out with a look of concern on his face, asking what had happened. I told him that there was a man under my bed, and his concern suddenly turned to rage as he rushed into my bedroom. He flung open the door and turned on the lights, demanding that the man shows himself at once. But there was no response, so my dad slowly got down onto the floor and peered under the bed. But there was no one there. My dad then climbed to his feet, looking confused, but then his eyes locked with the window as he saw my curtain flying in the wind. He asked me if I opened my window, but I couldn't bring myself to speak, so I just shook my head. He ran to the window and looked outside, but again, there was no one there. I'm not sure whether or not he truly believed me, but my mum and dad didn't seem to be that concerned. I slept in their bed that night, but other than that, we just sort of continued as normal, as if nothing had ever even happened. But over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I would regularly catch my neighbour peering into my bedroom window as he was walking by with his dog. I knew I had to do something, so in the end I went to the police. They tried to brush it off as harmless, but I knew something was seriously wrong. I started to sleep with a softball bat by my bed, and I even set up a camera in my room to hopefully catch him in the act. And then, all of my fears were finally confirmed when one night I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I knew someone was in the house. I grabbed my bat and tiptoed down the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. And as I turned the corner, I saw my neighbour standing in my living room, holding a broken vase in his hand. He was staring at me with a look of pure distress on his face. I swung the bat in his direction and demanded that he leave, so he slowly stepped back and then opened the back door, running off into the night. I quickly called the police, and they came to arrest him. Apparently, they searched his home and found a hairbrush and several pairs of women's underwear. I was mortified, but not too surprised. He ended up confessing to breaking and entering, but refused to admit that night he was hiding under my bed. I was frustrated at first, but now I don't care so much. The main thing is that he is rotting in prison. So for now, that's good enough for me. When I was younger, I lived in a small neighbourhood on the outskirts of town. Everyone in the neighbourhood was friendly, except for one man who lived in the house at the end of the street. He never spoke to anyone and never seemed to leave his house, except for a few times a week to get groceries, I presume. As I grew older, I became more curious about this mysterious neighbour. I would often sneak over to his house and peer through the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what was inside, but no matter how hard I tried, I could never see anything more than the occasional flicker of a light. One day I was walking home from school when I noticed something strange. The front door of the neighbour's house was slightly ajar, and I could see inside. It was dark and gloomy, with no sign of any movement or life. I was about to keep walking, when I heard a faint whisper coming from inside the house. It was so quiet that I almost didn't hear it, but when I turned to look, I saw a shadow move behind the window. I was scared, but I couldn't help but be curious. I could tell all my friends afterwards, and I'd probably be the most popular guy at school. So I crept closer to the window, trying to see inside, and that's when I saw it. A hand reaching out from the darkness and beckoning me to come closer. At this point, I didn't know what to do. Should I run or stay put? Well, my curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself walking towards the open door. Looking back, I don't know why I did this. It was as if I was in some sort of hypnotic trance, or maybe I was just that stupid. But as I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of musty air, like the smell of old books. The inside of the house was just as gloomy as the outside. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was old and worn. But what caught my attention was the sound of music coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. I followed the sound, my heart racing, and as I turned the corner, I saw another door, slightly ajar, with light coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. I'd come too far to back out now, but what I saw made me freeze in my tracks. There was a room full of dolls, hundreds of them, all in various states of disrepair. Some were missing limbs and others had their eyes gouged out. But what was even stranger was that they were all arranged in a circle, facing inward, as if they were having a conversation. I tried to back away slowly, but I tripped over something and fell to the ground. As I looked up, I saw the neighbour was standing over me, with a smile on his face. "You like my dolls? I've been collecting them for years. I love the way they look when they're broken." I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the house as fast as I could. When I got home, I told my parents everything. But of course, they didn't believe me. They just told me that I was being silly and that I should stay away from the neighbour's house. I never saw him again after that day, but I still wonder about what he was doing with all of those dolls and what kind of person he really was. But to this day, I still get chills thinking about that creepy neighbour and his collection of broken dolls. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural and the unexplained, so when I moved into my new neighbourhood and heard about the neighbour who lived down the street, I was immediately intrigued. Everyone in the neighbourhood had their own story about him, and they all seemed to agree that he was strange, and some even believed that he was dangerous. I had never seen him myself, but I was determined to find out more. I decided to take a walk around the neighbourhood, and as I passed by his house, I noticed that the windows were always covered in thick black curtains. It was odd, especially considering that every other house on the block had open, welcoming windows. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that something was going on inside that house that they didn't want anybody else to see. I started to notice other strange things too. The yard was always overgrown, and the house itself was in a constant state of disrepair, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it was about to collapse. One night I was walking home from a late-night study session at the library, and I decided to take a shortcut through the alleyway that ran behind my house. As I passed by the back of the creepy neighbour's home, I heard a strange sound. It was a low growl, like an animal, and it seemed to be coming from inside the house. I froze, unsure of what to do. I had never been this close to his house before, and I didn't know if I should run or stay put. But as I hesitated, the growling grew louder, and I could hear something else too. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, and they were coming towards me. I turned to run, but before I could take another step, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The curtains in the front window were now moving, as if someone was pulling them aside to look out. And then I saw them. 2 glowing eyes, staring right at me. I sprinted home as fast as I could, and when I got in, I locked all of the doors and windows and went straight to my bed. But I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, and the growling sound that I'd heard. The next day, I built up the courage to investigate further. I walked past the creepy neighbour's house, pretending to be on my phone, but secretly keeping an eye out for any signs of life. I noticed in the corner of the window what seemed to be a pair of hands, pale and gnarled, gripping the edge of the curtain in the front window. In that moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I watched as the hands pulled the curtain aside, revealing a face that looked like it belonged to a horror movie. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was safely back in my own house. And that's when I finally decided to call the authorities. I told them everything I had seen and heard, and they promised to investigate. Well, a few days later, I heard the news. Apparently, this neighbour had been arrested for a string of stalking incidents that had taken place in the neighbourhood. He had been keeping people in his basement, and the growling sound that I had heard was the sound of his dogs that he had been using to guard them. It was a horrifying realization, and I couldn't believe that I had been living so close to a monster this whole time. Even now, I can still see those glowing eyes and those pale, gnarled hands, and I can't help but wonder, are there more people like him out there, lurking in the shadows? Well, I'm just grateful that he no longer lives on our street, and hopefully I will never see him again. I always knew there was something off about my neighbour, Mr. Smith. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, and he never seemed to leave his house. Sometimes I would see him peering out of his window, watching me as I walked to school or played outside with my friends. It always made me uneasy, but I didn't think too much of it, at first. It wasn't until a few weeks ago, actually, that things started to get really creepy. I was coming home from school when I saw Mr. Smith standing in his front yard. I tried to ignore him and kept walking, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. When I got to my house, I looked back and saw that he was still standing there, watching me. That's when the weird things really started happening. Every time I would leave my house, Mr. Smith would be outside, either in his yard or on his porch, just watching. He never said anything. He never did anything. He just stared. And it wasn't just me. I would see him doing the same thing to my friends when they came over. One night I woke up to the sound of scratching outside my window. I was scared, but I told myself it was probably just a tree branch or something. There was a tree outside my window, so this did happen from time to time. But then, I could have sworn that I heard a faint whisper of my name. I froze. I couldn't see anything outside, but I knew someone was there. I was too scared to move or even breathe, but eventually the scratching and whispering stopped. but I still didn't sleep at all that night. The next day I went to my parents and told them everything that had been happening. They were concerned, but they didn't seem to think it was anything too serious. They told me to just stay away from Mr. Smith and to come to them if anything else happened. But things only got worse from there. One day I came home from school to find a note in the mailbox. It was written in shaky handwriting, but it clearly said, "I'm watching you. I know everything." I didn't know what to do. What did this message mean? What was it that he knew? I was too scared to tell my parents, and I didn't want to go to the police in case it wasn't anything too serious. So I just tried to ignore it and hoped that it would all go away. But it didn't, because the next night, I woke up to find Mr. Smith standing at the foot of my bed. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I screamed, and my parents came rushing in. But Mr. Smith didn't move or say anything. He just stood there until my parents had no choice but to call the police. They came and took Mr. Smith away, but a few days later, I found a box on my doorstep. Inside was a photo of me, my friends, and my family, all taken without any of us knowing. There was also a note that read, "I'll be back soon." This wasn't that long ago, and I don't know what to do. I'm scared to leave my house, and I'm scared to stay inside. I know he's locked up now, but there's still a part of me that feels like he's there, watching me. Also, Mr. Smith did have family that were almost just as weird as he was, and I wonder if he's getting them to do his bidding now. But nevertheless, all I know for sure is that I never want to see him or his creepy smile ever again. Growing up, I always knew there was something off about the neighbour who lived next door to us. I never really had any direct contact with him until that fateful summer day. I remember my parents had gone out for the day, leaving me alone in the house. It was a really hot day, so I decided to take a swim in our pool. But as I was swimming, I noticed our next door neighbour standing at the fence, watching me intently. I felt uneasy, but I just tried to ignore him and continue with my swim. But then I heard him call out to me. "Hey there, little lady. You're quite a good swimmer, aren't you?" I tried to be polite, responding with a simple, "Thank you," and tried to get out of the pool as quickly as I could. But the neighbour continued to make small talk, asking me about school and my hobbies. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice that his eyes were strangely intense and seemed to be fixated on my body. Then he asked me if I wanted to come over to his house for some lemonade. I politely declined, telling him that I needed to go inside to study. But he persisted, telling me that he had some cool games and toys that I might like. It was strange. How old did he think I was? As he talked, I felt more and more uneasy. His words were almost too friendly, and I could feel that there was something off about the way he was acting, like he was putting on a show of some sort. Finally, I told him that I had to go inside, and I quickly made my way back into the house and closed the door behind me. But as I was drying myself off, I heard a knock at the door. It was the neighbour, standing there with a glass of lemonade in his hand. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that I didn't want to be alone with him. I tried to be polite, telling him that I couldn't come outside, but he just stood there, staring at me with those intense eyes. Then, suddenly, he pushed past me and entered the house, uninvited. I tried to back away, but he grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. I struggled and screamed, but he wouldn't let me go. In that moment, I was so scared. He was muttering something under his breath, and his grip on my arm was getting tighter and tighter. I screamed again, hoping that someone would hear me. And then, suddenly, my parents burst into the house. The neighbour immediately let go of me and ran out, disappearing into the woods behind our house. They didn't see the neighbour, but when I told them what happened, they were extremely concerned. After that day, I never felt safe in my own home again. I was always looking over my shoulder, worried that the neighbour would come back for me. I started having nightmares about him, dreaming that he was lurking in the shadows, waiting to snatch me away. It wasn't until years later that I actually found out that neighbour had been arrested for some other crime. I read about it in the local paper, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw his picture. To this day I still feel uneasy whenever I think about him, and the terror that he brought into my life that day. As a young girl, I always felt uneasy around my neighbour. He lived alone in a run-down house with overgrown weeds in the front yard. He never seemed to leave his house during the day and only came out at night. His appearance was unsettling, with long, unkempt hair and deep-set eyes that always seemed to be fixed on anyone that passed him by. One evening, as I was walking home from a friend's house, I noticed that neighbour standing on his porch. He stared at me with a blank expression, not even bothering to wave or say hello. I quickened my pace, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice strange occurrences. I would hear noises coming from my neighbour's house at odd hours of the night, but when I peeked out my window, there were no lights on. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him through the window, pacing back and forth in a dimly lit room, and it always freaked me out. One night, as I was laying in bed, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like it came from my neighbour's house. I didn't dare to look, I was too scared, but as I laid there, I heard footsteps outside my door. I clutched my blankets tightly and waited, hoping it was just my parents. But then suddenly, my bedroom door creaked open. I could see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, but I couldn't quite make out any details. My heart was pounding so hard in that moment, I thought it might have burst out of my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, but I still couldn't make out his face. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, unable to find my voice. As the figure stepped closer, I could smell the stench of alcohol. He leaned down, his face now just inches from mine. "Well, don't be afraid. I'm just lonely." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that he would just go away. And when I opened them again, he was gone. After that night, I never saw him again. I did hear rumours that he had moved away, but I never knew for sure. When I think back to that night, I do sometimes think it could have just been a dream. It was always a little bit strange that I didn't see him again after that night, but realistically, I don't see how he could have climbed into my house. Or maybe I just can't handle the truth. But either way, I still get chills thinking about that night. And I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been so lucky. I always knew there was something off about my neighbour Mr. Johnson. He was an old man in his 70s and lived alone in the house next door to mine. I would often see the flickering of a candlelight through his windows. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think too much of it, until one day, I was playing in my backyard. I noticed that Mr. Johnson's garden had grown wild with weeds and brambles everywhere. It looked like it hadn't been tended to in years, and I could see that he had a small shed at the back of the garden, but it was almost completely hidden by the overgrown foliage. As time went on, I started to notice other strange things about Mr. Johnson. He would come out at night, always dressed in dark clothing, and I could hear him walking around his backyard in the early hours. Sometimes I would hear him even talking to himself, muttering words that I couldn't understand. I remember I was lying in bed when I heard a strange noise coming from Mr. Johnson's house. It sounded like someone was moving heavy objects around. I decided to investigate, and I crept out of my house and into my backyard. As I peered over the fence, I could hear Mr. Johnson's muttering growing louder. I looked through his window and saw him moving furniture around, talking to himself all the while. But as I was watching, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. They were small, beady and yellow, and they belonged to what looked like a rat that was perched on the windowsill. I took a step back in surprise, but then I noticed something else. There were rats everywhere, on the floor, on the furniture, crawling up the walls, and Mr. Johnson was completely oblivious to them, still just muttering to himself and moving objects around. I decided to leave at that point, and quickly went back to my house feeling sick to my stomach. But the next day, I saw something that made me even more creeped out. Mr. Johnson had set up traps in his garden, and there were dead rats lying everywhere. As I watched, he picked one up, examined it closely, and then I saw him put it in his pocket. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This weird behaviour made me start to feel like I was in danger, like Mr. Johnson was capable of anything. I decided to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me at first. I pointed out his garden in the upstairs window and begged them to look at all of the traps. And to be fair to them, they were concerned and contacted the authorities once they saw what I was talking about. When the police arrived, they found Mr. Johnson in his house, surrounded by rats apparently. He had become delirious, and he would always mutter to himself about the rats and how they were his only friends. They discovered that he had been hoarding food, water and other supplies for years, and that he had been living off the rats in his garden. It was a disturbing sight, and it still haunts me to this day. In the end, we had to move away because the rats were starting to infest in our own garden. Nevertheless, I still think about him from time to time. But I just hope that I never have to encounter anyone like him, ever again. As a woman living alone in a quiet suburban neighbourhood, it can be quite unsettling. Even when a community can be quite peaceful, it only takes one neighbour to make things feel uncomfortable. There was a man who lived in the house next to mine. He was tall and thin and had a sunken face with dark, beady eyes. I never caught his name. He kept to himself most of the time, so I just referred to him as the creepy neighbour. At first I didn't pay too much attention to him. As I said, he mostly kept to himself and rarely left his house, so there wasn't much to say. But then, that's when the strange things began to happen. Every time I walked out of my house, he would suddenly appear outside, almost as if he had been waiting for me. He would stare at me with a strange smile on his face that made my skin crawl. One night I was alone in my house getting ready for bed, when suddenly I heard a soft tapping at my window. I looked over to see the creepy neighbour standing in his yard, staring up at me with a sinister grin. I quickly closed the curtains and retreated to my bedroom, with my heart now pounding with fear. Over time, I began to notice that the creepy neighbour was always watching me. He would appear at odd times and places, as if he was tracking my every move. For example, whenever I walked my dog, he would always appear out of seemingly nowhere, and would try to make conversation with me. Eventually, he took it one step too far, and stopped me on my morning jog. I told him politely to leave me alone, but he just kept chasing after me. I warned him that I'd call the police, and he just laughed, and so I did. Unfortunately, they said they couldn't do anything unless he had made a direct threat against me. So I was on my own, with a neighbour who was becoming more and more unstable by the day. And then, one night, as I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise coming from outside my window. I looked out, and I saw the creepy neighbour digging in his backyard. It was the middle of the night, and he was digging a deep hole in the ground. My mind raced with the possibilities of what he may be doing, and I knew I had to act fast. The next day, I actually went to his house and confronted him about what I had seen. He denied everything, but I could see the madness in his eyes. It was at this point that I knew that I had to leave the neighbourhood before things got even worse. The police clearly weren't going to do anything, so I was left with no other option. I moved away as soon as I could, but I still feel the weight of that creepy neighbour's gaze on me from time to time. It's been years now, but I can never seem to shake the feeling that he's still watching and waiting for me to return to his twisted world. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was sitting in my living room with my wife, watching television. We had just moved into a new neighbourhood, and we were still getting used to our surroundings. Our house was in a quiet cul-de-sac, and our neighbours were a mix of young families and elderly couples. However, there was one neighbour who stood out for all the wrong reasons. He lived 2 doors down from us, and from the moment we moved in, he made it clear that he did not like us. Every time we saw him outside, he would glare at us with his piercing blue eyes and mutter something under his breath. We tried to ignore him and hoped that he would eventually warm up to us, but that never seemed to happen. One night I woke up to a loud noise outside. I got out of bed and went to the window, and that's when I saw our neighbour in his front yard. It was 2 a.m. and I couldn't understand what he was doing. I watched him for a few minutes just pacing up and down his garden, before eventually going back to bed. The next day, my wife and I decided to take a walk around the neighbourhood, but as we were passing by his house, he came outside and started yelling at us. He was screaming, "What are you doing here? And you don't belong in this neighbourhood." He started following us and continued to shout insults in our direction. Let me tell you, it was a terrifying experience, and we walked back to our house as fast as we could. As the weeks went by, his behaviour only got worse. He would stand in his front yard and stare at us whenever we left or came back to our house. He would always make loud noises in the middle of the night, and he would throw things in our garden. We tried to talk to him and ask him to stop, but he would just become angrier and even more aggressive. And then, one day, my wife and I came home to find a note stuck to our front door. It was from that very same neighbour, and it said he was going to make us pay for moving into his neighbourhood. We were terrified and didn't know what to do. Believe it or not, things only got worse from there. His staring had turned to stalking, as he started following us whenever we left the house. He would park his car outside of our house and would watch us from inside. We were living in constant fear, and we didn't know how to make it stop. He wasn't doing anything illegal, and the police would just apologise whenever we'd speak to them. But finally, the chaos inevitably came to a stop one night, when I woke up to the sound of someone trying to break into our house. I quickly woke my wife up and we called the police, and when they arrived, they found our neighbour outside, trying to break into the front door with a crowbar. He obviously wasn't the most intelligent man, as he was trying to break the door open on the wrong side. Nevertheless, he was arrested and taken away, and we never saw him again, but the fear and anxiety that he had caused us stayed with us for a very long time. Looking back on it now, I realised that we should have taken his behaviour more seriously from the beginning. I guess at the time, we were just too scared to do anything about it. But to be fair, this experience has certainly made us stronger. I just hope that it's one we will never have to go through again. Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.